Right, good day to everybody. This is a very exciting occasion and I would like to welcome you all. My name is Ingrid Kutsia. I'm the Director of Biodiversity, Health and Nature at ICLEI, Cities Biodiversity Centre based in ICLEI, Africa, here in Cape Town. And it is my great pleasure to welcome everybody, firstly our speakers, our panelists and all of the attendees, on behalf of ICLEI, as well as on behalf of our partners to this webinar. Before I talk a little bit more about the webinar, I just want to make a few house rules. In the first place, we ask that all the participants remain muted, please, during the webinar. But we welcome you to use your videos so that we can see each other if you have the bandwidth. And I must also say that the webinar is being recorded. So by participating in this webinar, it means that you give your consent to being recorded. If you have questions for any of the speakers, please put your questions in the chat box. And as far as possible, also the name of the speaker. We hope to have some time at the end to take questions from the floor. And then with that, those house rules over, I just want to say that the webinar today, Rising Ambition, the importance of subnational and local governments to reach the City by 30 targets for restoration and conservation, aims to identify the most effective options that local and subnational governments have to ensure that they too can contribute to the City by 30 targets as far as terrestrial, inland waters, marine and coastal ecosystems are concerned. And we're talking here specifically of targets 2 and targets 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted in Montreal in December last year. Now, if I can have the next slide, I just want to indicate basically, the webinar series is a series that we're going to be running for the rest of the year. And this is, we're starting off this month now to celebrate also International World Biodiversity Day. As we know, the theme is From Agreement to Action, Building Back Biodiversity. And the idea here is that we want to focus on a whole of government and whole of society collaboration. So ICLEI will host these webinars under the theme of From Action to Agreement. But we have the support of our partners, and I would just like to acknowledge them. You can see their logos at the bottom of the slide. So we are very happy to have UNEP as one of our partners, also the CBD Secretariat, the IUCN, Regions 4, and the European Committee of the Regions. The idea of these webinars, why we're doing them, is we want to maintain the momentum from COP15 to mobilize our cities also towards COP16. And it will provide an opportunity for all of us as representatives and from also cities and subnational governments and regions around the world to show how the local and subnational government constituency is going to contribute to the implementation of the GBF, as well as the plan of action on engagement of local and subnational governments that was also adopted at COP. And then if we can just go to the next slide, please. I just want to introduce our speakers. We really are very honored and thrilled to have such an impressive lineup here today. We have all of the big biodiversity conventions represented, as well as UNEP. And we deeply thank each and every one of you. We know that you're all busy people, and we really are very honored to have you here to share the global perspectives on protecting biodiversity and specifically also trying to reach the 30 by 30 targets. Following the messages from, firstly from Susan Gardner, who is the Director of Ecosystems Division in UNEP, we will then have a video recording from David Cooper, the Acting Executive Secretary on the Convention on Biological Diversity, followed by a message from Dr. Musonda Mumba, who is the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And finally, we will get a message from Amy Frankel, the Executive Secretary on the Convention of Migratory Species. And it's interesting to note that all our speakers are in very different parts of the world, and also our panelists. So we have a truly global audience and speaker lineup here today. With this, we are following these interventions from our high-level speakers. We have a panel discussion. I will introduce the members of the panel a little later. And basically, we have someone from a national government, the CBD party. We have someone from Quebec, from the city of Cape Town, and we will also have a short intervention from another subnational government. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you all Susan Gardner, who will start today's session with a message from UNEP as we celebrate Biodiversity Day this week. Thank you, Susan.
Well, thank you, Ingrid, and it's great to see everyone's greeting, colleagues, friends. I'm really pleased to join today, and just thinking about historically how cities have grown and thrived in areas where there were rich natural resources has created a result of every city having kind of an individual personality that's shaped by the natural environment. And that's true here at our UNEP headquarters in Nairobi. As you said, we're representing Kenya today. We have just right outside my office, there's large hornbills, these very social birds that perch outside the office window and look in to see, how late we're staying this evening. Or we get urban monkeys that'll be, rambling across the rooftops to see if there's any kitchen doors that were left open. But we know that in the 21st century, urbanization poses huge challenges, being these hotspots for resource demands, generating massive amounts of waste from these patterns that have been established with unsustainable consumptions. And by 2050, populations will expand to approaching 10 billion people, with urban populations expected to more than double in order to provide the housing, the food, the income, the education for these growing populations. So when we think about protecting global biodiversity, when we think about how we're going to achieve our SDGs, it's clear we have to recognize the importance of a focus on cities. And as you said, cities are essential for implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework, with the 23 targets that are serving as our blueprint now that we have this for the future, emphasizing solutions and actions, engaging all actors across societies, across economies. We know that that regional and that subnational context is really key for conserving nature while safeguarding the benefits that nature provides for people, for their livelihoods, for their health, for their food, which is really at the heart of the historic resolution at UNEA 5 that provided a definition of nature-based solutions, really recognizing the power of nature-based solutions for addressing simultaneously the 3 planetary crises of biodiversity, climate, and pollution, while providing invaluable ecosystem services for the populations. For example, we've seen that urban trees in 10 of the world's mega cities reduce pollution to such an extent that it saves over $480 million per year in health costs. And so that's why UNEP is so committed to supporting this work. We were very happy to be supporting the Summit for Subnational Governments and Cities at the Biodiversity COP last year. We're very eager to continue in supporting subnational governments to engage in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, with the aim of restoring ecosystems in 1,000 cities by 2030. We're also really pleased with programs like Urban Shift that reimagine how to build cities incorporating the power of nature-based solutions as part of the foundation, because we know that this works. We know, for example, in Morocco, where there's green corridors that were integrated into city planning, or in Kigali, where wetland restoration supports biodiversity at the same time it's reducing flood risks. So there's so many examples, but we know we have to also do more. We just published this year the State of Finance for Nature in Cities, the first report of this type. that showed that in 2020, nature-based solutions received just 0.3% of the overall spending on urban infrastructure. So we definitely have to significantly grow investments into incorporating nature in cities. And this happens when we include nature as part of urban planning. This happens when we support investments in sustainable business models, when we track those investments so we know where they're going and how they're working, or where we map out the key actions that city stakeholders can take to go even further. So I would just say that reaching the GBF targets we know is not going to be an easy task. We understand that. But we have the solutions and we have them right at our fingertips. We know that reaching 30 by 30 needs the whole of government and whole of society approach, and that cities offer that opportunity to actually get it right, to be more climate friendly, to be more socially inclusive, more economically responsible. We can be more ecologically restorative while supporting biodiversity. So in closing, I'll just say this is really an opportunity for all of us to work together. I'm so pleased to be part of this amazing group of speakers talking about how we work together to bring nature back into cities, which is ultimately how we transform our entire relationship with nature. So thank you.
And thank you very much for those very inspiring messages. And yes, the whole point about investment at the city level and also at the landscape level is very important. And we will be dealing with one of those, that topic in one of our future webinars. I know that you are very busy, Susan, and you may have to leave early. So very welcome to do that. But thank you very much again. Our next speaker is going to be David Cooper, who's joining us via video. David is actually in China at the moment, where they are celebrating International Biodiversity Day. So we have a video from David, and I'm going to ask my tech team just to upload that, please. And while I do that, where they do that, maybe just to say that we're really very grateful to be able to represent these constituencies and of cities and subnational governments. So let's watch and hear what David Cooper, the Acting Executive Secretary of CBD, has to say.
This year's International Day for Biological Diversity is an especially significant one. It comes after the historic moment at COP15 in December 2022, where we witnessed the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, an agreement by the world to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. The agreement is an important step towards achieving the global vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. But now we must move from agreement to action. This is how we will build back biodiversity. This is how we will clean our air and our water. This is how we will have food security. This is how we will limit zoonotic diseases. This is how humankind builds a sustainable future on this planet. We must act urgently in order to see tangible results by 2030. Governments, businesses, consumers, we all have a role to play in the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Governments need to urgently develop national targets to align with the targets and goals of the framework and to put in place policies and programs to achieve them. Businesses need to assess and disclose impacts and pivot towards sustainable practices. You and I need to reduce waste and shift to more sustainable consumption. And one of the most critical pieces of the puzzle that each and every one of us can do is to talk about biodiversity. The more we mainstream biodiversity, the more successful all other efforts will be. This International Day for Biological Diversity, as we move from agreement to action and the world collectively begins to build back biodiversity, let us all accept the challenge before us. Let us do our part to implement the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and work towards achieving its goals and targets, the Sustainable Development Goals and our shared vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050.
Thank you very much. And we indeed are talking about building biodiversity back. And with those words, I am going to hand over now to our next speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Musanda Mumba. She's the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And over to you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Greetings, everyone from Switzerland. It's an absolute honor actually to sort of follow up from Susan and David, and just really listening to both of them around the message of how do we anchor this very big and ambitious process of what the Global Biodiversity Framework is, and bring it into a reality around the very places that we call home, where most of us live, in cities. And I'm reminded very much, and Susan alluded to that in relation to the, some of the beautiful places I've lived in or even worked in. Place like Nairobi, that's got Karura Forest, spaces here where I live very close to Lake Limon, just along the city of Geneva, and where we're beginning to see conversations around the biodiversity within the lake and the phytoplankton that is so necessary to sustain the fisheries in this lake system, just here within the Alpine region. I also want to recognize that, COVID-19 taught us something that was so important and that was so critical: the power of partnerships and the power of collaboration. We cannot do what we do as a convention, focusing on the wise management of wetland ecosystems, without our UN partners, without IUCN, which is an international organization partner, and many, many other partners, including private sector entities such as Danone, for example. And it's through these partnerships that we've been able to also amplify the message of why the Global Biodiversity Framework matters so much, not just for our cities as they are, but also anchored in the ecosystems that are very much providing the very water that we're dependent on, the clean air, and all of that. Recently, I was in Kigali actually last week, and I was involved very much in the restoration agenda of the Nyandungu wetland system. And it was fascinating because I managed to speak to Will Wilson, who's written a book on the birds of Kigali, and how most of these beautiful and amazing bird life is suddenly returning to the city, simply because an ecosystem has been restored or is getting restored. And similarly, the communities downstream are obviously dependent on much cleaner water, and really just beautiful dynamics happening. But more importantly, the information that is given to the citizenry, because each one of us has a role to play as a citizen of our local spaces, of our cities, of these very spaces, as I mentioned, we call home. I want to finish and touch a little bit on the point that David alluded to, the issue of our sustainable consumption and our patterns, that in terms of how they're basically affecting the very biodiversity that we're trying to protect. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is a decade that is now just about six years to go before the end of the Sustainable Development Goals, had these very ambitious, ambitious cities that were included as some of the flagship priorities. And within these, flagship priority cities, very much the agenda around restoration is very key. The world is going to be meeting starting this weekend or early next week in Paris to talk about the very element of beating plastic pollution, which for all intents and purposes goes through mostly wetland systems. How do we do that? Because we need to do that, and most of this starts from within cities and is washed further on downstream, with repercussions not just to us as humans, because we know that science has shown that now there is plastic in our bloodstream, but also to the very species that we're trying to protect in this 30 by 30 agenda as well. I want to close also by saying that we're very excited. We're very excited as a convention that when we had our last COP in November of last year, the Wuhan Geneva COP, there was a lot of conversation and discussion, and we had the very first outcome on a resolution that focuses on youth and wetlands. Let us remember the inclusivity and making sure that the younger generation are also included in the conversation, because they are also citizens of the future and citizens of the current spaces that we call cities, and very much important in that decision-making process going forward. So I'm really looking forward to these discussions. I'm looking forward to listening in to the past and current and future webinars, Ingrid, and all these discussions that are really coming and bubbling up to the surface, because I think there's an urgency right now in the world that we need to do things differently. And I think cities are very much well positioned to do that better and to do that in a more agile and quicker way to make sure that our spaces are more biodiverse, restorative, and also healthy and resilient at the same time. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the discussions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mumba, and especially also for recognizing and reminding us about the power of partnerships and collaboration and working together. And indeed, that I think is one of the things that we're trying to also do with these webinars. And I'm also reminded that in fact, in early June, there will be a mayor's roundtable of wetland mayors in Amiens, France, where there's going to be another gathering of people coming together and agreeing how to take action for nature. So with those words, thank you. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Amy Frankel, sitting in Bonn. We really are hopping around the world this afternoon. And Amy, from the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, it's your turn to give us a message and to address the audience. Thank you, Amy.
Okay, thank you so much, Ingrid. It is truly a pleasure to join you and colleagues here and to provide some remarks on behalf of the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, which is also known as CMS. Cities and nature have always been closely interconnected. Most fundamentally, cities are usually built where there are natural resources to sustain them, rivers and oceans, forests and arable land. And even the most urban cities that come to mind, like New York, Tokyo, Johannesburg, Dubai, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo, have green spaces that host migratory species alongside their human populations. Yet the importance of protecting the nature found within and around cities is sometimes forgotten. Cities and other subnational governments have an enormous role to play with respect to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and in achieving the Global Biodiversity Framework, including in particular the 30 by 30 target and the restoration target. So to name just 3 things that cities can do to contribute to these targets and to the well-being of migratory species. First is to have well-planned city development. It's absolutely vital. Habitat loss and destruction is one of the greatest threats to biodiversity and migratory species. Urban sprawl can also bring people closer to wildlife, increasing the risk of poaching, illegal hunting, and zoonotic disease. Second, conserving and restoring green spaces in cities is incredibly important, both for people and for nature and migratory species that we try to protect. Third, ecological connectivity is essential for biodiversity and migratory species and is a central element of both targets 2 and 3. Now we know now that nature cannot function through islands of protected areas. The connectivity among sites of importance to migratory species, along with the natural flow of resources, must themselves be protected. Interestingly, and very importantly, Target 12, which specifically calls for enhancing ecological connectivity in urban and densely populated areas, is a target directly aimed at cities and subnational governments. And so connectivity is well understood in that target. Now, importantly, all of these measures are not only key for achieving targets 2 and 3, but they have many other added benefits, including for human health, for economies, and for climate change mitigation. This is a very big year for CMS, with our COP14 to be held in Samarkand, Uzbekistan at the end of the year, in the heart of the ancient Silk Road. It will be the first biodiversity COP since Montreal. The issues I briefly mentioned and many others of interest to cities and subnational governments will be on the agenda, including new guidelines on reducing light pollution, with which we worked closely with ICLEI, mitigating infrastructure impacts on migratory species, and we'll also be launching a major new report on migratory species and climate change. I always say I love working with cities and subnational governments because this is where things get done. We look forward to strengthening our engagement with ICLEI and cities and subnational governments and invite you to participate actively in our COP14. Thanks very much, and over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Amy, and especially also for that invitation to come to your COP. We certainly will be there. And just again, I think the thing that struck me from all of the messages that we've received this afternoon is the interconnections between the different conventions and the critical role that cities and subnational governments can play in contributing to all these contributions. It's a great call that we have received from our executive secretaries and secretary generals this afternoon. And I'm really confident that our cities and subnational governments will take up this challenge. So thank you to you all. I know, Amy, that you two are very busy and that you're not able to stay for much longer. So we thank you. And I'm going to move over now to the next part of the our webinar. And we've heard now some really inspiring messages from UNEP, from the CBD, from the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, from CMS. And with this, I want to introduce our panelists who represent the different levels of government. And we're going to have their perspectives. And we are going to hear from them what they are planning to do in terms of taking forward the challenge of protecting more biodiversity. And I'm hoping that Dr. Mumba is able to stay a little bit longer with us. And firstly, I want to introduce our panelists that have not yet been introduced. So we have Jean Lebert, who's a very old friend of ICLEI's, and we've done a lot of hard work together. We've just had a very successful summit and pavilion at the COP15. And Jean is the emissary for climate change and Nordic and Arctic issues at the government of Quebec. We then also have Flora Makorola. She's the Deputy Director General for Biodiversity and Conservation in the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in South Africa. We have Lorna Slater, who's the Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy, Biodiversity in the Government of Scotland. She is going to be not able to join us today, but we have a recorded message from her. And we then also have Julia Wood, who's the Manager of Biodiversity at the City of Cape Town. I'm hoping Dr. Munda can still stay a while, but I'm going to ask Jean, because I know he too has to leave. I'm going to ask you a question, in fact, 2 questions, and then hopefully we have time for a third one. But Jean, you can recall the leadership role played by subnational governments in the GBF negotiations. Do you feel that we've achieved our objectives? And as a second part of that question, now that the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has been adopted, what role do you foresee for city and subnational governments as far as implementation is concerned?
Thank you, Ingrid. First of all, I'm not a very old friend, but that's fine. No, I'm really happy to be here with you know, all the great people that we heard. I think that it's very interesting because what we were able to do with the COP15 and all the 4 years before, where we were working together trying to negotiate, is you know, that principle now that is accepted, that it's an all of government approach and all of society approach, is really the key. Just like Amy just said, because this is where things are done, you know. So, and it's quite amazing that we took so many years to you know, have that victory at the end, because we know that the future will pass by subnational government and cities. I mean, this is clear for me. This is probably clear for you as well, Ingrid. And this is where we now have to transform those years where we were asking to be around the table to real action. So now that we are around the table, we really need to sit down and try to go with action. And this is where, you know, collaboration with cities, with other subnational and states is very, very crucial. Like said Dr. Mumba, we are in the right timing, I think, you know, where things have to change. If we look back, what we did with the Aichi target, for example, you know, we didn't succeed because we were not enough involved. Now we are there, we are around the table, we have to work together to really go to action. For us, it was an honor to have the COP15 in Montreal, and but that was not enough. We put lots of pressure to be able to have a real plan of action that will make a difference, at least for Quebec. So we announced a nature plan with a pretty important budget, $650 million, where we will be able to really get that 30% done in the south of Quebec, which is a priority for us, but also to help others. And I think, you know, when we think of the whole of society approach, all of government, we have to help others, means other government, other cities. So we will bring you international project to help others. So that's part of our engagement for the year to come. Of course, we will be very active. We advisory committee and our major group, Ingrid, local and subnational, and it's a voice. It's an important voice, and you know, we should bring more state, more cities to be able to really well represent, you know, local and subnational government. This is our role, and this is something that we have to continue to do together.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you mentioned your nature plan. I would like to actually hear a little bit more about it. I'm also glad you talked about the major group and that we're here together and that we really need to get more cities and subnational governments. I'm hoping that we will see many cities and subnational governments from your part of the world also there, and yourselves. And I know also that in other areas we are working together. I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Amy or Dr. Mumba who talked about the plastics protocol. And I understand that you are also participating in that process. And so I think that this whole point about working together is really important. And if you can tell us a little bit more about your nature plan and also what opportunities and challenges you foresee going forward.
Well, you know, the new nature plan is important because you can have very good idea, but if you don't have the money that go with it, you know, it's very difficult. So we were able to put, you know, a big amount of money, to be honest, $650 million for a province like Quebec. It's a lot of money. We also have another fund to work for restoration. That fund is already 120 million something, you know, plus that 650 million. So that's a lot of money. We are dealing also a protocol with Canada where they will put more money. So, you know, it's the first time that we will have almost, you know, $1 billion for biodiversity, which is really something, you know, that we were dreaming on, but now it's real and it's new money. So we're really proud of that. And I think that what we have to focus for us, it's in the south of Quebec, where, you know, biodiversity is very important. Of course, the north of Quebec is also very important for local communities and indigenous. So we will start consultation process with all the communities and civil societies. So they will be part of that nature plan. That nature plan is on 7 years. So we want to start really well by consultation with public and civil societies and indigenous and this is, I think, very, very important to be sure that the money will go to where we need to invest. Also, we started an academic project in collaboration with California and different universities. And this is very interesting because we want to give tools for politicians and decision makers on where we should put those protected area. Where is the best place to apply that 30% of protection and conservation? And very often it's difficult because there's lots of economics that is in the balance. So with that study, they will put everything together, the benefit and the cost, and it will help to make good decision. So it's a real important nature plan, and it's with lots of consultation. So we hope that we will be able to bring some tools for others also. What was the best shot that we did during that nature plan? What was the mistake? So we will be able to share with others, the good and the bad of that nature plan. And yes, Ingrid, we will be in Paris next week for the Inc. 2, and we want to be really involved because climate, biodiversity, and pollution are very important, and we are in the right moment, I think, in the history to make things move.
Thank you, Jean. And that reminds me, when you mentioned climate, that I understand that there's going to be quite a big nature track at the climate COP towards the end of the year. And I think that that's another arena that we can use. I mean, David Cooper was saying we need to talk about biodiversity, and that is, I think, an area where we certainly can talk a lot about biodiversity. Just one last question, and then I will hand over to our next panelist. And that is the point about how to track progress against your nature plan and how you will share that with the rest of the world. Because I think what you're doing in Quebec is really, it's very inspirational. And I think it's also great that you have this whole of government, whole of society approach, and that you're wanting to help others. So it would be good to know how you will track your progress and how you will share the information on that with the rest of the world.
Well, that's interesting because what we did, and it started before the COP, we have an inter-ministerial committee. So we want to be sure that all the things that we're going to do with the nature plan will be followed by different ministers. So we have the input before, we will have the input during the process and after. So, and it's the same thing that we start with the civil society and local communities. So we will have to, of course, bring results to all those levels of society, So it's going to be very interesting to share the result and share the idea at first where we're going to apply, that measures for the nature plan. So it's really something different that we try. We try to put everybody around the table to be sure that what we will propose will come from them and will be shared with everybody. So of course it's going to be easy for us, for Rachel and I, after that, to bring those results to you partners, and you will be able to use, like I said, the good thing of it, and where we did some mistake, if we do, we will probably. So, but it's again, a new way of making things where everybody is around the table, and I think this is really, really important. So we will be happy, of course, to share all the results with you.
Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate your inputs. And I know that you may have to leave us sooner. So on behalf of everybody here, the partners, ICLEI, and all our attendees, saying thank you to you. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Hi, sorry, my thing muted itself. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Mumba. I see she is still here. And Doctor, you talked about the power of partnerships, the power of collaboration. It would be interesting, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it would be interesting to get some reflection from yourself on this example from Quebec. We haven't yet heard from the others, but how you see that as a collaborative and partnership initiative, and particularly how, you know, maybe some expectations in terms of your own convention, whether, you know, there's a specific need for more attention to being focused on wetlands at the subnational government level, where we're working across different landscapes as opposed to just within city or municipal urban boundaries. The other point that you made that really intrigued me was around youth. This is our future. And it would be interesting to hear also, you know, what we as subnational governments could do to draw the youth more in, and how we can teach them and how we can engage them about these global conventions that often it doesn't make much sense to them because they don't necessarily operate or function or work in that area. So I'd be interested to know if you've got any ideas about that as well.
No, thank you so much for that question, Ingrid. I think I want to start with the latter question around the youth, because I think what we have to be aware of is that, you know, these young people are very much aware of what's happening within their communities. And we've seen how the youth constituency, particularly within the climate change discussion, has been incredibly engaged and very much, you know, proactive for what they lack in experience. I think they have in sort of really being forceful and curious, and also challenging the status quo as well. And so when this is now anchored down to wetlands, I mean, I just came back from Uganda, you know, where I witnessed firsthand what's happening within the restoration agenda and how they're engaging, you know, young people in like fish farming, etc., and moving them away from growing rice, because the return on investment isn't just as good enough in comparison to fish farming, which also has elements of clean water and also just really restoring some of the ecosystem services at the micro level, or at least the microclimate of an ecosystem. And then we talk about green jobs. I mean, for all intents and purposes, I think cities have been quite instrumental. And now more than ever, there's a lot of discussion around how cities can be involved in supporting and championing green jobs. And this brings me to that element in question around restoration and collaboration. I was in Nairobi last week, where I met with the World Resources Institute, who together with UNEP and UN Habitat are part of that Nairobi Rivers Commission that President Ruto has actually put together and is really championing. And what was insightful and really, you know, exciting for me, because I was involved in 2007, 2008 in the whole Nairobi River discussion, and I'm feeling a little bit, my goodness, I think I'm growing old. How are we back here again? You know, how do we have some level of leadership and making sure that everything is anchored within a very policy and local government level? But what's exciting is how, for instance, at the political level, President Ruto is challenging to say, look, Nairobi River isn't just a river that flows right through the city on its own terms. There's a much bigger and wider catchment area that is also connected to it, but also what we do not see below the surface in the form of groundwater. So who are the different stakeholders, you know, the private sector that are involved in borehole drilling and all of this? You know, who are all these diverse stakeholder constituencies that need to be at the table when we talk about wetlands? Because we cannot talk about wetlands in isolation just at the political level. We need to have, you know, the whole of society approach, I think, which is what wetlands do, because they bring and center and convene people together, because you're dealing with one element and one aspect of a resource. And so back to your question around collaboration, I think for us as a convention, what's been exciting is that, you know, when we have resolutions come out of COPs, those give legitimacy to the likes of ICLEI, to the likes of IUCN and other, partners, to now begin to take that forward and anchor it in reality and do a test case, as it were, on what works and what wouldn't work. But also, I think that as John mentioned earlier on, I think, cities are very much experiential spaces that are breathing and are very alive, and, they're agile and they're changing fairly quickly, even when they're not very well planned. So I'm really excited to see a lot of change happening. And also, just in closing, the very fact that more than 60% of the world's population will be in cities not so long from now. We used to think 2030 was so far away, but it's 6 years away to go. And 2050 is just 20 years, which is not a long time in human years. So we need to be prepared now for what is future fit and what is future relevant and necessary in a world that's changing fairly quickly. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think that besides the issue of the point of use that you made, something else that occurred to me, and we're seeing it particularly where we work with young people, is often the new technologies, the digital technologies. They're far more experimental, and they're not scared to use new technologies. And there's some really interesting developments, so that in terms of conservation, in terms of doing baseline assessments and predictions and all of these sorts of things. And this is, I think, an area where those of us that have been in this business for long can learn a lot from the youth, also how we can use technology to make our lives easier. So there is another question that I have from, in fact, it's a question from the floor, and it has to do about the disconnect between nature-based solutions, biodiversity, and consumers. If you have anything that you'd like to say about that, how one deals with the disconnect. Particularly, I think wetlands are probably an area where you see it a lot, because often wetlands they become dumping grounds for plastic or for pollutants and effluents, etc. So if you'd like to say something about that, it would be great. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. And I'm not sure who's asked the question. I think it's Christine. You know what, let me talk about from the consumer perspective. One of the wetland sites that we're actually discussing, and sort of it's in the news now more than ever, is Doñana wetland site in Spain, which for all intents and purposes, it's drying up very quickly because of the agricultural activities around it. And these agricultural activities are very much something that, the whole sort of insatiable appetite for strawberries in the winter, something that's out of season. People want to have strawberries for their parties, for all their cakes, etc., and all of that. But that's already killing a wetland system. And how is it doing that? The farmers that are around Doñana wetland system, which is a Ramsar site and also a World Heritage site, have been over abstracting from the aquifer. And so with this over abstraction, they're leading to really extreme drying, and really we begin to see that this pathway of migratory bird species, home to many people, and a space that has a microclimate that has implications on Spain as a country. And we already have had fires in Spain since January, and that begins to tell you something is amiss. But the person here in Geneva who's buying a pack of strawberries from Spain in Migros supermarket does not make the connection to this wetland system. So also this speaks to the very issue that you mentioned, Ingrid, earlier on. How is this message then passed on and articulated? How do we raise awareness to say, a lot of our activities, our human behaviors are also killing wetland systems that we're also dependent on for water, for microclimates, and for all of that. So these are conversations that need to happen. For example, we have had a 25-year relationship with Danone, because Danone, Evian, which is where their bottled water comes from, is also a wetland of international importance and a Ramsar site just across from Lake Léman. And also similarly, working with Danone, how do we make sure that they're investing very well for small farmers, because the modus operandi of Danone is water dependent. And how are they investing in restoration, not just in the areas where they do their business, but also in areas where they're actually working with their respective constituencies. So it's all about collaboration, and also the messaging. How do we package this messaging so that the average person is aware. And also this jargon, we keep using big words and, big things, but the average person, we have to really anchor these in realities in a language that's accessible rather than being elitist, because, we go to COPs and people are like, what's a COP? What does that mean? We're having this religion. How do we anchor this into realities and communicate in a way that's accessible? And for me, I see it in the way I communicate to my children, just so that they understand the kind of work I do, and they see the lake outside of the window from the house and why this lake matters. And they were curious as to why there wasn't enough snow in the Alps. And I'm connecting to these, planetary dynamics. We have to anchor this in a language that's absolutely accessible, and really timely, and something that is in our everyday language, so that everybody, if we're talking about our whole of society, we have to cater for everybody who is part of society. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And with those very wise and inspiring words, I'm going to thank you. And I realize you probably have to go, so we'll say goodbye. I'm going to ask my next question to Flora Makrola. She, as I said, is the Deputy Director General of Biodiversity and Conservation in the National Department of Environment Affairs in South Africa. And Flora, if you are able to just put your video on, if possible, otherwise just unmute yourself. I have 3 questions for you. South Africa has recently adopted a white paper on the conservation and sustainable use of the country's biodiversity for implementation. And we would really like to hear a bit more from you about this white paper and how South Africa, as one of the CBD parties, will use this white paper to implement the GBF nationally. Flora?
Thank you, Ingrid. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to friends across the world, and happy Africa Day, Dr. Msonda Mumba and all other Africans in the webinar. I'm going to request that I switch off my video, but that is just my face. Thank you very much. And thanks for this invitation. Certainly our cabinet has just approved the white paper on conservation and sustainable use of South Africa's biodiversity. You would know that South Africa is one of the 17 mega diverse countries in the world, and therefore we are home to a number of key species. We have high levels of endemism. We have a very active, sustainable use component in respect of biodiversity. We trade in over 200 species. And also that we consider ourselves a conservation leader. We have in excess of about 16 or so % of our conservation estate in formal protection in the country. And as part of advancing the Global Biodiversity Framework, we have embraced the 30 by 30 target, which is going to form one of our key implementing lever for the white paper on as approved. So the white paper was approved at an opportune moment just after the GBF was adopted in Montreal. And we had developed the white paper very much parallel to the GBF process. And certainly there are high levels of alignment between what is in the white paper and what is in the Global Biodiversity Framework. We have about 4 broad goals, which are closely aligned with the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is around conservation, sustainable use, access and benefit sharing. And we've got a very specific goal around transformation, especially for our country, South Africa, due to the fact that our sector is very much untransformed. And then we've got what we call 2 enabling goals, one which relates to mainstreaming, which is where matters of national and subnational and local governments come in. And the other goal then relates to resourcing and how we resource the implementation of the white paper. Within our constitutional framework, we have a concurrent system in respect of biodiversity management in the country, and therefore what we do at national government has to find its way and expression in what subnational and local governments are doing or have to do, and therefore we work together in respect of advancing South Africa's biodiversity and conservation policy goals. So we work quite close together. In actual fact, recently we were co-hosting the local government biodiversity in Daba, which really emerged with quite concrete recommendations in respect of how we bring in local government, especially in the implementation of the white paper and the global biodiversity framework. In a few weeks' time, we will be hosting a national GBF implementation workshop where we are interrogating implementation mechanism around the 30 by 30 target, obviously including target 2, and looking at what could be the role of all stakeholders when we talk about this whole government and whole society approach. It's something that we take and embrace very close as a country. In actual fact, on the 22nd, just a few days back, we were engaging with the business sector in respect of how we can collaborate. So this particular workshop I'm referring to that we are holding on the implementation of the 30 by 30 is one that will then include all the stakeholders across government and across society. So we are well on our way as a country to implement the global biodiversity framework aligned to the policy objective as we are advancing them in the white paper. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Flora. And Flora, I know, having worked in the same department also with you for many years, that South Africa has a very interesting approach to protected areas and to OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures. And in a sense, we apply a whole of government and whole of society approach to that, when particularly insofar as the new targets, the 30 by 30 targets are concerned. Would you just like to tell us a little bit more about how it works in practice? And then just share with the rest of the world what we do here in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. And by the way, the 16% that I highlighted earlier on is just terrestrial. We are, in respect of marine protected areas, we are sitting at about 15% or under protection also. We have a national protected area expansion strategy. And in terms of that particular strategy, our target is to reach at the rate at which we are growing our protected area network will be 28% by 2036. And therefore we are ramping up back to 2030 in order for South Africa to make a contribution to the 30 by 30 target. Further to indicate that in terms of our legislative provision, as Ingrid is indicating, we have different mechanisms of recognizing different types of conservation areas contribution to the conservation of our rich biodiversity. And yes, we do have a category under stewardship where we work with community-based or private landowners in respect of their contribution to placing their land to advance certain conservation objectives. And in most of the work that we are doing as national government, when we work on programs around stewardship, we then include local government participant and subnational government participant in those particular consultations. We are working on a mechanism now to recognize other effective conservation measures, or ECMs. And this is certainly an area where local government, especially our cities, are going to be playing a much greater role. I have worked in a city myself before, and I know the importance of protecting and conserving cities' biodiversity and the contribution that cities can make towards advancing the country's goals also. But just to say that we are working with organized local government around developing an open space framework, which open space framework, the areas that we're particularly interested in are wetlands as a high priority. And we are pride ourselves in the fact that the city of Cape Town is one of those that are recognized as the wetland accredited city. And we are looking for those areas of connectivity because those are quite important, especially for biodiversity, as they make quite a very huge contribution, and they are very much not highly recognized in respect of the contribution that they are making. And therefore, this open space framework that we are developing, and I need to indicate that as and when we work with national and subnational governments, we also make grants available that are then used to rehabilitate and restore the integrity of some of these areas, and also turn them for use by people, for whether it be it for recreational or for mental uses also. So we do as a country advance, and obviously, Ingrid, I know we will talk at some stage around the need for how do we resource all these ambitions that we are having, and certainly we are ready to demonstrate that we do have a plan, and we believe that our plan is something that can be shared, and we can exchange our knowledge in respect of what we are doing around conservation and biodiversity as a country, but also that it is a plan that can be attractive to donors and to philanthropies alike, so that biodiversity can be adequately conserved. And lastly, just to say that we put a lot of emphasis also around the qualitative elements related to conservation estate in the country, because it's quite important that as much as we're looking at increasing the quantity in respect of the 30 by 30, that even with the existing network, that at a qualitative level, they are effectively managed and they are effectively governed. That is quite critical to us also. But further to that, to ensure that we are able to retain and increase species diversity. You will know that big mammals play a big role within our conservation framework in the country. And we will continue to rewild where we can rewild, and also expand in respect of range expansion with countries where we are able to expand range of some of the important iconic species that we have in the country. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you. I have one last question for you. I mean, you've given us just so much information here, but coming back to the sort of the white paper, the national implementation workshop that you're planning, I'm reminded of the fact that your department actually held several dialogues, well, before COP, on the post-2020 GBF with municipalities and provinces. And then early this year, just after COP, your minister got together. It was still in our holiday period. It was early in January, and she convened in Durban a meeting of all stakeholders, including subnational governments and cities, to give feedback. And I think this is a really great thing to do, that the national government goes back to its stakeholders and explain what were the outcomes. But I think the thing that I would like to understand is, looking at it from as a national government perspective, what would you like to see cities and subnational governments do more to help you in implementing the white paper, the NBSAP, and all of these other amazing plans that you've shared with us?
Thanks, Ingrid. We already have provision for subnational government and cities to play a role in biodiversity, legislated so in the fact that there is a requirement for them to develop what are called bioregional plans. We've had experiences previously also with some cities also developing local biodiversity strategy and action plans also. And there's also a requirement in terms of our legislation to develop bylaws related to biodiversity also. I think from our perspective is that we believe in ongoing dialogue and engagement and partnership, because biodiversity knows no boundaries. and any loss of biodiversity will affect all of us in the country. And therefore, what we would like to see happening is further collaboration with national and subnational government. We do have structured mechanisms of engagement. I need to say that we meet on a quarterly basis with national and subnational government, and local government to discuss areas of common interest around biodiversity in the country. We would like to see more bottom-up projects, especially from local government level, especially in respect of restoration. We have a huge challenge in the fact that open spaces, wetlands are gobbled up in pollution and littering. And we are working with some of them in transforming some of the spaces into green spaces across the country. We should also commend those municipalities that over the years have worked very hard to green the cities. I've worked for the city of Johannesburg, and in the time that I was there, before 2010, we planted in excess of over 100,000 trees. And the landscape of Johannesburg, especially in those disadvantaged areas, has just transformed remarkably. And that program also included the redevelopment and the restoration of open spaces. And this is a program that served as a blueprint for other municipalities across the country, and we've expanded that particular process and would like to see, especially cities, to be much more assertive in really putting their biodiversity profile up there. I think the city of Cape Town is doing quite remarkable. The fact that they are a Ramsar accredited city already puts them up there in another league, and we would like to see more cities coming forward to be recognized and accredited in other respective elements in relation to biodiversity resources also. Thanks, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Flora. And I'm going to hand over to Julia Wood. We have a power outage for her, and I hope her battery lasts. But Julia, you've heard what DDG has just told us. You needn't put your video on, Julia. It might save your battery. And I think that it would be really great to hear from Cape Town what you're doing in your city to protect biodiversity and to contribute to the national and global targets. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm not load shed yet, so there might just be a pause when everything goes dark and I just change my system, but it should be fine. I should be fine. It should be a seamless thing, but I might just be nervous when I end up sitting in the dark. So just bear with me. I'd like to just go back a little bit, Ingrid. And I was also, and it's actually been very nice to follow follow that. It's been great. And I think the one thing from COVID that has been quite great is been our ability to stay involved with the discussions around the targets, the BFG, the targets around the white paper, because it automatically means that we can, we sent the links, a lot of it's online. So I just wanted to thank DFFE and on all of you, we've been able to be quite involved. So from us, I wanted to talk about two things quickly. I firstly wanted to go back a little bit, and Ingrid and I actually have worked for many years, and we've been very, very involved in ICLEI. And I just wanted to say that we were one of the founding cities in the lab program all those years ago, which is now sort of moved into Cities with Nature program. But one of the big things about the lab program is they made us all and assisted us all to get a state of biodiversity, which is really, really fantastic, because it gave us a state. We'd already done a biodiversity network by that stage, but to have a written document with it was fantastic. And the other thing that they assisted, and I think this is like about their value of partnerships, is they assisted us with a local biodiversity strategy and action plan, which actually was first approved in 2009. So And then the interesting thing was it was approved for 10 years, okay? And then now we've just been rejigging it. And in fact, we had an internal audit in the city and we all felt that it wasn't actually detailed enough with timeframes and that. And we actually now looking at it and we've actually approved the strategy part of it. Which has been approved by council in 2019. So that was 10 years later. So we got that through. And now we redoing our detailed action plan. And it's actually really, really interesting because we're on the cusp of where a lot has been changing globally. So that's a very exciting thing. And we're hoping to have our first proper draft out by the end of June. And hopefully then it will go through the approval process. So I just wanted to say how important partnerships have been with ECLI and the assistance we've had with the local biodiversity strategy and action plan, and also that we're quite involved with Working Group 1, and we're involved with I think it's outcome 10, Flora, you'll have to just remind me. And it actually means that we can link up into international government. So that's a really, really important thing. And as well as that, everybody knows that we've done our fine scale plan for the city, which is basically accepted by ourselves, our provincial authority, Cape Nature, and SANParks, which is the National Conservation Authority. And that's really the Bible that we all work to. So we have our targets and we have obviously been doing incredibly well in those targets. Okay, sorry, I just paused because I'm in the dark. So just give me a sec till I get this light here. Okay, sorry, can you still hear me? Ingrid, am I still on?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm just sitting in the dark, so just please bear with me. But the important thing was that we, so in terms of our targets, our biodiversity network is about 85,000 hectares, okay? Which is about 34% of the municipality. We're going to struggle to get to conserving the whole of the bionet. But basically, we at the moment with SANParks and Cape Nature and Stewardship, as well as some other government landowners, we own about 55,000 hectares, which is about 22%, 22.3% of the municipality. And obviously the mountains, of course, are conserved and the lowlands are under conserved. So we are sitting in the stage where we need to just relook a little bit at our at the other conservation areas and our targets to actually get, because we were doing really well in terms of Aichi targets with 17%. Obviously, we very much focused on the terrestrial, but we also have quite a big coastal sort of effort in the city, and obviously that has also been looked at, the coastal with national government about the conservation areas along in the marine environment. But what I'm focusing on is really the terrestrial side. And so we are sort of sitting in the situation where we're doing very well in terms of the IG targets, and now we need to relook. But obviously Cape Town is really, really biodiverse, so we don't want to lose a focus of biodiversity and then adding some of the like maybe river corridors that aren't high in biodiversity, but form a very important ecological function. So we might end up kind of reporting in two places, reporting on the biodiversity and then reporting on the other targets. So at the moment, we're kind of looking at it, but and trying to see how we can include everything. But I'd like to just carry on a little bit, Ingrid, if that is possible, just to look at how we're managing some of the areas, or would you like to ask another question?
No, I think you can talk a little bit about that, and then I have one last question for you.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, brilliant. And then, okay, so in terms of management, because it's very easy to get international funding and local funding to start, get your plan, start, but it's very difficult to go the long haul. And we as a city have had to be incredibly innovative by going for the long haul. And the first thing, we are very lucky in South Africa because we've had many bioregional programs funded by Jeff, and one of them, which was a Cape Action Plan for People and Environment, which is amazing. It just shows that the power of the partnerships of getting together, getting the effort, and recognizing how important the city was within that partnership. And in fact, one of the, and I started looking at how can I measure the effectiveness on my nature reserves. And in fact, And this was many years ago. It was about 2007, I think. Yeah. So long ago. And we actually then looked at the World Bank management effective tracking tool. And we actually adapted it to the city and to our reserves. And very quickly it became adapted to the stewardship side. Some of them, Cape Nature took it on. And then actually at that stage, and it's now, it was taken on nationally. And I think that just shows like how critical municipalities can play in that role. So now protected areas in South Africa, every second year do the management effective tracking tool, and we have a fantastic online system where all the data is captured. So that's really something working in partnership with nature, and we and in partnership, and then we can directly upload our information through to national government. So that's been a fantastic partnership. But obviously just by the Met, it often looks at how well you as an organization are doing, and not so much well in conserving biodiversity. So, actually it doesn't actually measure exactly how well you're doing on the ground. How well is your biodiversity? How well are you restoring your biodiversity? So what we've done on all our nature reserves is a habitat restoration plans, and then we've got a priority list of what areas we're going to restore. And I think the incredible thing that we have done is we have sort of revolutionized how we do work by basing a lot of our alien clearing and our restoration work on expanded public works program, which is employing people at a rate on temporary opportunities, and we have obviously managed to attract quite a lot of ongoing funding through that, which means we can provide job opportunities in local communities. And this is probably one of the biggest benefits that we have. I mean, apart from our ecosystem services and all our other benefits, which became incredibly important when we had day zero and we were realizing how important our reserves are for protecting the aquifers, and also protecting the water source areas. But the big thing about the skills development, we started thinking, oh, it's very nice creating all these green jobs, but it doesn't actually create livelihoods for people. So what we decided to do was skills development programs. So people start in a short-term contract, they get skills, they end up on a skill development program, which is an opportunity for 3 years. And then they then have opportunities to apply for permanent jobs within the city of Cape Town. And in fact, probably 2/3 of our vacant posts per year are actually filled by people who were expanded public works program staff. So that's been an absolutely fantastic thing. So it's actually creating careers. But then obviously we need to be very careful with operational funds. As I said before, it's very easy to attract funding, but didn't keep it operationally. And we have been into a program of land banking where we can buy, where we're given funds to buy land, which offsets development from housing. And we've been incredibly successful at buying up tracts of land in areas which obviously are important on the BioNet, but they've also put within our spatial plan as an area of important conservation. So it's not areas that we're going to be housing, so that we're actually facilitating housing opportunities. And we've just actually been given some money for staff posts as an offset for some of the housing developments as well. So we've been given some of the land, and now we're actually getting some posts to permanently manage the area, which for me is absolutely fantastic. The big thing that we haven't invested so much in is our
Thank you.
what we call our P&Cs, our environmental education, but luckily with this offsets money, we are being able to create posts for environmental education. And the last things, Ingrid, before I hand back to you, is our big challenge has been because the city is an ideal place to do conservation, because you have so many people around to support job creation, support the city, for us to give information, for people to understand how important it is to live with nature, to live in harmony with nature. But the big thing that we have in a big city like Cape Town is huge security costs. In fact, most of my budget goes towards security costs. And the other big thing that we've had recently is unlawful land invasion. Yeah, I think I'll end there, Ingrid. Sorry, I talked so long.
Thanks. And in a sense, you have actually responded to the second question I was going to ask you. We are fast running out of time. So I am now going to, there were some questions in the question and answer box. And in fact, there's two questions, and I'm going to ask Flora if she would like to respond to them. They have to do with the role that the landscape horticulture industry has in contributing to biodiversity efforts. Flora, if you have any points that you'd like to raise about this or comments you'd like to make, and if we have time, Julia, I will come back to you because I think we've lost all of our other speakers already. Flora, anything to say about the landscape horticulture industry and biodiversity?
Thanks, Ingrid. We have identified that agroecology is very important as part of a contribution to biodiversity. I think that there is a space for it. What will we have? Where will we get butterflies and bees if it wasn't for the horticulture landscape? So they play quite a very important role in respect of their contribution to ecosystem services at a broad scale. I am mentioning agroecology because one of the often not adequately recognized is a biome, which we in Southern Africa are rich in, is grasslands and the savannas, which play a very important role in sustaining, especially our big mammals, you know. So we would like to believe that as we are advancing the 30 by 30, we need a recognition of all types of landscapes, all types of uses that contribute towards conservation and biodiversity. And also we need to have representative biomes, you know, so that at a qualitative level of our mega diverse nature as a country, that we are able to demonstrate that we recognize the contribution of all types of landscape. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Flora. We're going to end our sort of panel discussion and questions now because we have one last video from Minister Lorna Slater. She is from the Scottish Government, and we're going to play that now, and then I will do the wrap up right at the end.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I can't tell you how excited I am to be part of a global network that is working toward nature protection and restoration, to protecting what we have and putting back what we've lost. People in the past had more birds than we do, more animals, more forests, more wetlands, more bees, and more butterflies. People in the past had more flowers than we do. That makes me feel really sad, like we somehow have less joy too. At COP15 in December, we saw the whole world sign up to protect 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. We also saw the world commit to nature restoration and just transition. We don't have to continue this downward trend of loss. Scotland is a very nature depleted country. Over the past 30 years, nature has declined by 24%, even while we've been trying to protect it. We need a dramatic change in direction, which is why we've developed a strategy to halt biodiversity decline by 2030 and substantially restore nature by 2045. To do this, we need to take a whole of government, whole of society approach. Scotland has some particular challenges in reaching 30 by 30 because almost 100% of land in Scotland is managed. We don't have the uninhabited wilderness that you find in Canada, like where I grew up, nor do we have large areas safeguarded by people following traditional Indigenous lifestyles. Our challenge is implementing 30 by 30 in a modern working landscape and ensuring a just transition for those communities. We have to ask the question, What does a farm that is protected for nature look like? What does a commercial forest or a grouse moor that is protected for nature look like? We're developing a new agriculture support scheme informed by our vision for agriculture, which puts nature and climate at its heart, alongside food security. We are also working on improving ecological connectivity across Scotland. We have committed to develop nature networks across Scotland, joining up our polka dots of protected areas and wildlife islands into thriving nature corridors. I see a particular role for our national parks in Scotland in leading the way. Unlike in many countries, in Scotland, our national parks have within their boundaries farming, commercial forestry, towns, grouse moors, and other industry and businesses. Our parks will be able to pilot and demonstrate how these activities can be conducted successfully alongside nature restoration, and create a model for not only the rest of our country, but for the rest of the world in how people and nature can thrive together. People ask how a tiny country like Scotland can make a difference, but our particular challenges in Scotland may create opportunities that benefit us all. In addition to our unique challenges, we also have many which are common to all of us. How do we increase the biodiversity we have in our urban spaces and bring people closer to nature? How do we ensure that those damaging our environment are made to pay to restore it, making the polluters pay? And how do we finance all of this, acknowledging that governments alone cannot shoulder this burden and that private finance must be brought in? I look forward to working with you and learning from you as we face these challenges together. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank ICLEI for their leadership and ambition for biodiversity.
Thank you very much in your absence, Minister Slater. And it just remains to me to thank everybody. We've had a truly international audience here today, not just in terms of our speakers and panelists, but also from our attendees. We've had people from the States, we've had people from Canada, Nairobi, South Africa, the East, Colombia, all over the world, literally. And it's real testament to how important our governments at all levels, national, subnational, and local, view biodiversity and the need to protect and restore it. And I want to just thank you, all of our speakers, Susan Gardner, David Cooper, Dr. Mumba, Amy Frankel, and then our panelists who joined us this afternoon, Jean Lemire, Julia Wood, we have Flora Mokluhoa from the Department of Environment in South Africa who are still here, and of course through the video, Minister Slater. Thank you to you all. Please join our next webinar, and the link is in the chat box, and we wish you a very good evening or morning or the rest of the day. Thank you again, and let's build back biodiversity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Goodbye.